Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's not just for the books, but for understanding the world around us, really. We're diving into the changing face of war, um, a subject that's especially crucial for you UPSC aspirants out there, especially those of you navigating the complexities of international relations.
Absolutely.
The UPSC exam is no walk in the park.
Right.
And IR is a key battleground for anyone aiming for a career in diplomacy or foreign policy. But even if you're not prepping for the exam, this deep dive is going to be fascinating for anyone who wants to grasp how global conflict has transformed. We'll be exploring some intriguing questions, like are new wars really that different from the old wars we read about in history books? What makes these modern conflicts so difficult to win? And has the very definition of war itself been challenged? To help us unpack all of this, we have our expert, who is a master at connecting historical context with current events.
Well, I'm excited to delve into these questions with you.
So let's start with the basics. Before we can dissect new wars, we need to understand the traditional Clausewitzian view of war. What's the classic picture that comes to mind?
Picture two states, each with their well-defined armies clashing on a battlefield, their objective, achieving clear political goals, almost like a strategic game of chess between nations.
Makes sense. But then things get more complicated, right? That's where the idea of new wars comes in.
Exactly. These new wars defy that neat Clausewitzian model in some pretty fundamental ways. Instead of being solely about interstate conflicts, they're often civil wars fueled by internal divisions and identity politics.
So more internal struggles than battles between nations.
Precisely. And the way they're fought is also different. New wars are often asymmetrical, meaning you have a powerful state clashing with a weaker group or faction that uses unconventional tactics. Think David versus Goliath, but with a modern twist.
That already sounds a lot more complex than the traditional model.
It gets even more complicated because new wars often blur the lines between combatants and civilians. This makes them incredibly messy, unpredictable, and often more brutal. The source material highlights conflicts like those in former Yugoslavia, the war on terror, and the rise of insurgency tactics as prime examples.
Those are some heavy-hitting examples. So the million-dollar question is, why are we seeing this shift? What's driving the world away from the traditional model of war?
That's where things get fascinating. There are a number of contributing factors. For one, we've seen the spread of democracy around the world, and with it, the creation of what are often called zones of peace.
So more democracies, less war. Is it that simple?
Well, it's not a foolproof formula, but democracies are generally less likely to go to war with each other. They tend to prefer diplomacy and negotiation over armed conflict.
Okay, so that's one piece of the puzzle. What else is contributing to this shift?
Globalization is another major factor. The world's interconnected now more than ever. This economic interdependence makes war a less appealing option because of the potential economic fallout. No one wants to disrupt the global supply chain if it means hurting their own economy in the process.
Makes sense. War is bad for business, as they say.
Indeed. Globalization has also fueled a shift in moral attitudes towards war, especially with the influence of organizations like the UN. There's a growing sense that war is a last resort, not a first option.
So economic interests and evolving moral attitudes are playing a role. But what about the technology of war itself? Has that changed the equation?
Absolutely. We can't ignore the elephant in the room, the devastating potential of modern weaponry, especially nuclear weapons. The sheer scale of destruction they can unleash makes large-scale war between major powers a terrifying prospect, something most leaders would want to avoid at all costs.
It's a sobering thought. So it seems like old wars might be on the decline, at least in some parts of the world. But does that mean the world's a safer place? I have a feeling the answer is more complicated than that.
You're right to be skeptical. The decline of interstate war doesn't necessarily translate to a world free of conflict. In fact, as we're seeing, the rise of new wars presents its own unique set of dangers.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were discussing how new wars present these unique challenges to global security. It's not just a change in tactics. It's a fundamental shift in the very nature of conflict.
That's right. And to understand these new wars, I think it's helpful to look back and see how they evolved. The seeds were actually sown back in the mid-20th century.
Interesting. Which conflicts are you thinking of?
Well, think about the national liberation movements in places like Algeria, Vietnam, and Palestine. Those struggles weren't just about territory or political control. They were deeply intertwined with identity, with this fight for self-determination and freedom from colonial rule.
So these movements were early examples of how identity, politics, and ideology could shape conflict.
Exactly, and their tactics were also a preview of what was to come. They challenged traditional military powers by adopting guerrilla warfare, mobilizing popular support, and blurring the lines between combatants and civilians.
And these tactics were surprisingly effective.
Right, they were. They proved that military might alone wasn't enough to guarantee victory. And this lesson became even more apparent after the Cold War ended. We saw a surge in conflicts in places like Somalia, Liberia, Sudan, and Congo. These were some of the first major examples of new wars as we understand them today.
So the end of the Cold War was a turning point. It created a vacuum that allowed these new wars to flourish.
In a way, yes. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the old bipolar world order led to this period of instability and uncertainty. Old rivalries resurfaced, new ones emerged, and many of these conflicts were fueled by the very characteristics we've been talking about. Identity politics, asymmetrical warfare, the blurring of lines between combatants and civilians.
And sadly, this trend has continued into the 21st century, hasn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. The breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s led to a wave of new wars in places like Bosnia and Chechnya. And then, of course, there's the ongoing war on terror, which has further fueled this trend.
It's almost like the world has entered this new era of conflict, one that's less about traditional interstate wars and more about these complex, messy internal struggles.
I think that's a very insightful observation. And this new era of conflict presents some serious challenges for the international community, challenges that our current systems might not be fully equipped to handle.
That's a concerning thought. Can you elaborate on those challenges?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is that traditional approaches to peacemaking just don't work as well in these new wars. The old model often focused on negotiating settlements between states. But in new wars, you're dealing with multiple factions, shifting alliances, and a complex web of grievances that are much harder to untangle through traditional diplomacy.
So the old playbook is out the window. What kind of new approach is needed?
We need strategies that recognize the complexities of new wars and prioritize the protection of civilians. This means finding ways to engage with non-state actors, address the root causes of conflict, and invest in peace-building efforts.
And these new wars often result in humanitarian crises, right?
Yeah.
The massive displacement of people, the refugee crises, the impact on innocent civilians.
Absolutely. And the blurring of lines between combatants and civilians makes it incredibly difficult to protect innocent people caught in the crossfire. And this raises some serious ethical and legal questions about the conduct of war in the 21st century.
So what can be done? Is there any way to make warfare less brutal and destructive in this new era of conflict?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. There are no easy answers, and any solution will require a fundamental shift in how we approach war and peace. The first step is recognizing that the old ways of thinking about war simply don't apply anymore. We need to develop new approaches to conflict resolution, ones that are tailored to the realities of new wars.
So less emphasis on military solutions and more focus on diplomacy mediation and addressing the underlying causes of conflict.
Precisely. And this requires a more collaborative approach. We need greater cooperation and coordination among states, international organizations, and civil society groups. It's not just about governments talking to each other anymore. We need a multifaceted approach to tackle these multifaceted challenges.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's be realistic. The world's a pretty divided place right now. Is there really enough political will to make these kinds of changes?
You're right, it's not going to be easy. But I think there's a growing recognition that these new wars pose a threat to everyone, not just the countries directly involved. The instability they create can have ripple effects that are felt globally. Think about the refugee crisis, the spread of terrorism, the impact on global trade and economies.
Right. Those consequences are impossible to ignore. They impact everyone, even those who are geographically far removed from the conflict zones.
Exactly. And that's why it's in everyone's interest to find ways to prevent and resolve these conflicts before they spiral out of control.
So even though there are challenges, you're saying there's a glimmer of hope, that this shared threat could actually push the international community towards greater cooperation.
I believe so. We're already seeing some positive steps. The UN and other organizations are working to develop new frameworks and strategies for dealing with new wars. There's a growing understanding that we need a paradigm shift in how we approach conflict in the 21st century.
That's encouraging. It sounds like we need to rethink the very concept of security in this new era.
I agree. We need to move beyond the traditional model of security as solely a military matter. New wars demand a broader perspective.
A braver perspective. Can you expand on that?
It's about recognizing that security is not just about protecting borders, it's also about protecting people, ensuring their safety, their well-being, and their ability to live with dignity. This is often referred to as human security.
So human security takes a more holistic view. It considers the needs and rights of individuals, not just the interests of states.
Precisely. It's about addressing poverty, inequality, injustice, and all the factors that can make people vulnerable to violence and exploitation. It's about empowering people to participate in decisions that affect their lives and hold their leaders accountable.
That sounds like a big shift in perspective. It's not just about military might. It's about addressing the root causes of conflict and building a more just and equitable world.
Exactly. It's a challenging but essential task if we want to create a more peaceful and secure future. And this brings us back to one of the key characteristics of new wars that we touched on earlier, the role of identity politics. I think this deserves a closer look because it's such a powerful driver of conflict in today's world.
You're right. We talked about how new wars are often fueled by identity politics. But I'm curious, what are some of the underlying factors that contribute to these divisions in the first place? What makes people so willing to fight and kill in the name of identity?
That's a crucial question. It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but there are a few key factors we can point to.
Let's hear them.
Well, one of the most significant factors is historical grievances. Many of these conflicts are rooted in long-standing tensions over land, resources, or political power. These historical wounds can fester for generations and be easily exploited by those seeking to stir up division and violence.
So it's not just about the present, it's also about carrying the baggage of the past.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of political and economic marginalization. When certain groups are excluded from power or denied access to resources and opportunities, it creates a sense of resentment and alienation. This makes them more susceptible to extremist ideologies and more likely to resort to violence to achieve their goals.
So inequality and the feelings of being left behind can be powerful drivers of conflict.
Absolutely. And then, of course, there's the role of propaganda and misinformation. In the age of social media, it's easier than ever to spread divisive rhetoric and demonize the other. This can further entrench existing divisions and make conflict more likely. It creates a climate of fear and distrust that makes peaceful coexistence difficult.
It sounds like a vicious cycle. Historical grievances fuel resentment. Resentment leads to marginalization, and marginalization makes people more vulnerable to extremist propaganda.
That's a very astute observation. And breaking the cycle is one of the biggest challenges we face in addressing identity wars. It requires a multi-pronged approach that tackles these issues at their root.
So how do we do that? How do
Yeah.
we counter these divisive forces and promote a more inclusive and peaceful world? It seems like a daunting task.
It is, but it's not impossible. I think there are a few key things we can do. First and foremost, we need to address the root causes of inequality and marginalization.
Okay, so how do we do that? What concrete steps can be taken?
Well, it requires a commitment to social justice and economic development. This means promoting policies that ensure equal access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities. It means creating political systems that are truly representative of all citizens and give everyone a voice in the decision-making process.
So creating a more just and equitable society where everyone has a chance to thrive.
Exactly. And it also means tackling discrimination and prejudice in all its forms. We need to promote tolerance and understanding between different groups and create a culture of respect for diversity. This can be done through education interfaith dialogue and promoting cultural exchange programs.
That's a big ask, but it seems essential.
It is. We also need to find ways to counter the spread of propaganda and misinformation. This means promoting media literacy, supporting independent journalism, and holding social media platforms accountable for the content they host.
So basically equipping people with the tools to critically evaluate information and resist divisive rhetoric. To be more discerning consumers of information, especially in the online world.
Exactly. It's about empowering people to think for themselves and make informed decisions based on facts and evidence, not on fear and prejudice.
It seems like education and awareness are key here.
They are. And finally, we need to invest in conflict resolution and peace-building efforts. This means supporting organizations that are working to mediate disputes, build bridges between communities, and promote dialogue and reconciliation.
So it's not just about preventing conflict. It's also about healing the wounds of the past, about addressing the trauma that lingers long after the fighting has stopped.
That's right. Reconciliation is a long and difficult process, but it's essential if we want to create lasting peace. It's about acknowledging past wrongs, fostering forgiveness, and finding ways to move forward together as a society.
Well said. All of these ideas sound crucial if we want to create a more peaceful world. And this brings us back to our initial question. Are new wars truly different from old wars?
Mm.
After all this discussion, I think the answer is pretty clear.
Yes, I think it is. We've seen how new wars challenge the traditional model of warfare in fundamental ways. They're often civil wars fueled by identity politics, fought asymmetrically, with a blurring of lines between combatants and civilians. They're more complex, less predictable, and often more brutal than traditional interstate wars.
And they require a different set of tools and approaches to address them.
Absolutely.
Mm.
We can't rely on old strategies to solve new problems. We need a paradigm shift in how we think about war and peace in the 21st century.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been unpacking this heavy but crucial topic, of how warfare has transformed. And in this final part, we're going to look ahead. What does it all mean for the future? Especially for you UPSC aspirants out there, understanding these shifts isn't just about acing exams. It's about shaping the world you'll be working in.
Yeah, and it's relevant for everyone listening because the implications of new wars are global.
Exactly. We've established that traditional interstate war might be declining, but that doesn't automatically make the world safer.
Right. New wars present their own unique set of threats to international security, and those threats are often much harder to contain and much more difficult to resolve.
And the impact often spills over national borders, right? Think about the refugee crisis, the spread of terrorism, even the way these conflicts can disrupt the global economy.
You're hitting on key points. These new wars can destabilize entire regions and have far-reaching consequences for countries far beyond the immediate conflict zone.
So the big question is the current system of international cooperation even equipped to handle these kinds of challenges?
That's the crux of the matter. You see, the current system, largely built around the United Nations and other institutions, was designed in a different era, primarily to prevent and manage traditional wars between states. It's not as well suited to deal with the complexities of these new wars.
So is it time for a system upgrade? What needs to change?
We need to adapt. For starters, we need to move beyond a purely state-centric view of security. New wars often involve a whole range of actors. Non-state groups, armed militias, even criminal networks. We can't simply ignore them or pretend they don't matter.
So a more inclusive approach, even if it means engaging with actors who might be considered unsavory or illegitimate by some states.
Exactly. We also need to shift our priorities and put more emphasis on conflict prevention and peace building. Addressing the root causes of conflict before they erupt into violence is key. This means investing in diplomacy, promoting economic development, and encouraging good governance. It also means supporting initiatives that build bridges between communities and help heal historical grievances.
So being proactive rather than reactive,
Right.
getting ahead of the curve instead of just responding to crises as they explode.
Precisely. This requires a change in mindset. We need to move away from the traditional idea that security is solely a military issue. New wars force us to think about security in a much broader sense.
We've touched on this before, but can you unpack that idea a bit more? What does it mean to think about security in a broader sense?
Well, it means recognizing that security is not just about protecting borders, it's also about protecting people, ensuring their safety, their well-being, and their fundamental rights. It's about creating a world where everyone can live with dignity and opportunity. This is what's often referred to as human security.
So human security puts people at the center. It's about addressing issues like poverty, inequality, and injustice, all the factors that can make people vulnerable to violence and exploitation.
Exactly. It's about empowering individuals and communities, not just focusing on the power of states.
This all makes sense in theory, but I have to ask the skeptics question. Is the international community actually capable of making these kinds of changes? There are so many competing interests, conflicting agendas, and a lack of political will at times.
You're right, it's not going to be easy. But I do think there's reason for optimism. The very nature of these new wars with their global ripple effects is forcing nations to recognize that these problems can't be ignored.
So the shared threat could actually be a catalyst for greater cooperation.
I believe so. We're already seeing some positive steps in this direction. The UN and other organizations are working to develop new frameworks and strategies for dealing with new wars, and there's a growing recognition that we need a more comprehensive, human-centered approach to global security.
That's encouraging news. And it's a reminder that even amidst the complexities and challenges of modern conflict, there's always hope.
There is, but realizing that hope requires sustained effort, commitment, and a willingness to adapt and learn from the past.
Well said. And that brings us to our final thought-provoking question, especially for you dedicated UPSC aspirants. Given the changing nature of war and the complexities of modern conflict, what are the implications for international security and cooperation in the 21st century? What role should organizations like the UN play in this new landscape of warfare?
It's a big question, and what we've explored today are just some starting points. The truth is there are no easy answers, no magic solutions. But by understanding the evolving nature of war and by embracing a broader, more human-centered approach to security, we can start to build a more peaceful and just world.
That's a powerful message to end on. And for all of you listening, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic, asking tough questions and engaging in constructive dialogue. After all, peace is not just the absence of war. It's something we must actively build and strive for each and every day.
I couldn't agree more.
And that's a wrap on this deep dive into the changing face of war. If you found this episode insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your fellow UPSC comrades and anyone interested in understanding the complexities of the world we live in. Until next time, keep diving deep.